On June 22, 1941, Germany unleashed the full might of its war machine upon the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa began with the overwhelming successes of the Wehrmacht. German tank wedges swiftly severed Soviet defenses, advancing 50 to 60 kilometers a day into the country's interior. It seemed nothing could stop this deadly onslaught. Minsk fell a week after the war began. The western Dvina and the Dnieper, natural water barriers, were forced on the fly. Hitler's command already saw the towers of the Moscow Kremlin on the horizon. However, in the path of Army Group Center stood the ancient Russian city of Smolensk. It was here, on Smolensk soil, that the German blitzkrieg first stalled. What was planned as another swift breakthrough turned into a protracted, bloody battle that stretched for 2 months. For the first time since the beginning of World War II, the German war machine encountered an obstacle it could not overcome immediately. The Battle of Smolensk became a turning point, the first warning bell proclaiming the possible collapse of the lightning war strategy. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. This concept became the calling card of the German war machine at the beginning of World War II. Its creators are considered to be German military theorists Hans von Zecht and Heinz Guderian, who developed the foundations of new combat tactics in the interwar period. The essence of blitzkrieg lay in the rapid breakthrough of enemy defenses by concentrated tank formations with massive air support, quick advance deep into enemy territory, and encirclement of large enemy groupings. In Poland, in the autumn of 1939, this strategy underwent its first baptism of fire. The result exceeded all expectations. The Polish army was defeated in 35 days. In the spring of '40, German tank divisions swiftly crushed the defenses of Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The defeat of the French army, considered one of the strongest in Europe, was particularly telling. Guderian's and Kleist's tank corps broke through the fortifications at Sedan and within days reached the English Channel, cutting off a significant part of Anglo-French forces. France capitulated in 6 weeks. Key elements of blitzkrieg were the concentration of armored forces on narrow breakthrough sectors, close interaction between tanks and aviation, the use of radio communication for coordinating actions, and maintaining high rates of advance. German tank divisions operated as a single mechanism, where each element complemented the other. Ju-87 dive bombers, nicknamed Stukas, suppressed pockets of resistance and created passages for tanks. Motorized infantry consolidated the achieved success. Planning. Operation Barbarossa. The German command expected to apply the same strategy against the Soviet Union. According to the calculations of the General Staff of the Army, 8 to 10 weeks were allotted for the defeat of the Red Army. Hitler was so confident of success that he told his generals, "When we start the war against Russia, the world will hold its breath." German strategists believed that Soviet troops would be defeated in border battles, and then German tank wedges would rush to Moscow, Leningrad, and Kiev. By the end of June 1941, the situation of Soviet troops on the Western Front became catastrophic. Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal von Bock, advanced deep into Soviet territory with astonishing speed. In just 2 weeks of fighting, the Red Army lost almost all of Belarus. On July 3, Minsk fell, and 5 days later, German tanks had already reached the Dnieper. The losses of Soviet troops in the border battles were colossal. General Pavlov's Western Front lost over 300,000 men, 3,500 tanks, and 4,000 artillery pieces. Dozens of divisions were encircled, communication between units was disrupted, and troop control was virtually non-existent. The front commander and his staff were removed from their positions and later executed. The Soviet command feverishly tried to organize a new defensive line along the Dnieper and western Dvina, but these lines were also quickly breached. It seemed that nothing could stop the German official. However, it was at this critical moment that the Stavka of the Supreme High Command decided to hold Smolensk at all costs. The strategic importance of this ancient Russian city is difficult to overestimate. Smolensk stood on the main road to Moscow, the famous Smolensk Road, along which Napoleon's troops once marched on the Russian capital. The city was located in the center of the so-called Smolensk Gate, a relatively narrow space between the upper reaches of the Dnieper and the western Dwina. Whoever controlled Smolensk controlled the shortest path to Moscow. To defend this key line, the Stavka hastily formed new armies. Fresh divisions were transferred from the Urals, Siberia, and the Far East. New formations were created on the basis of the remnants of the Western Front. On July 10th, the Reserve Front was formed under the command of Marshal Budyonny. And on July 16th, the Front of Reserve Armies, led by General Bogdanov. The German command perfectly understood the importance of Smolensk and threw its best tank formations into this sector. The 2nd and 3rd tank groups of Generals Guderian and Halt. According to the Barbarossa Plan, the capture of the city was to be the last major obstacle before the decisive thrust towards Moscow. The Smolensk land, with its hilly plains, dense forests, and river barriers, presented a challenging theater of operations for the Wehrmacht's mechanized formations. This region, located on the western approaches to Moscow, possessed unique geographical features that the Soviet command sought to exploit to slow down the German offensive. The landscape of Smolensk Oblast was characterized by an alternation of uplands and lowlands. The Smolensk upland, with its hills reaching up to 250 meters, created natural defensive lines. Numerous rivers, the Dnieper, Desna, Vop, Vyazma, intersected the enemy's lines of advance, forming water obstacles, the forcing of which required time and specialized equipment. The region's road network played a special role. In 1941, there were only 2 highways suitable for the movement of large mechanized formations: the Minsk-Moscow Highway and the Warsaw Highway. The remaining roads were dirt tracks which, in rainy weather, became impassable for vehicles. This forced German tank groups to move along a limited number of routes, which facilitated the organization of defense and counterattacks. No less important were the vast forest areas, covering about 40% of the territory. Forests limited the maneuverability of tank formations and made orientation on the terrain difficult. Moreover, they served as ideal cover for Soviet troops and emerging partisan detachments. The Soviet command planned to use these geographical features to create an echeloned defense. The main centers of resistance were located on dominant heights, controlling key roads. Water barriers became natural lines where the enemy could be delayed. Special attention was paid to the Dnieper, the most powerful waterway in the region, the forcing of which posed a serious problem even for well-equipped German troops. Furthermore, the Soviet command took into account that the summer period in these parts is often accompanied by prolonged rains. Washed-out roads could significantly slow down the advance of German equipment and stretch the enemy's communications. Indeed, in July 1941, the weather became an ally of the Soviet troops. Torrential rains turned many sections of roads into impassable swamps. By the beginning of the Smolensk battle, the alignment of forces in this strategic direction reflected a dramatic contrast between the German war machine, honed in battles across Europe, and the hastily re-established Soviet defense. Army Group Center, commanded by Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, represented a powerful striking fist of the Wehrmacht. It comprised 2 field armies, the 4th under Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge and the 9th under Colonel General Adolf Strauss, as well as 2 panzer groups, Guderian's 2nd and Haught's 3rd. The total strength of Army Group Center was approximately 600,000 men, 1,900 tanks, and over 1,400 aircraft. These were battle-hardened formations, with victorious campaigns in Poland and Western Europe behind them. Particularly noteworthy were the panzer divisions, equipped with experienced crews and the latest technology, T3 and T4 tanks. The German infantry was fully motorized, ensuring high mobility and a rapid pace of advance. Air cover was provided by units of the 2nd Air Fleet under the command of General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring. Soviet forces in the Smolensk direction represented a heterogeneous grouping, consisting of remnants of units shattered in border battles, as well as fresh reserves hastily transferred from the country's interior. After the catastrophe in Belarus, the Stavka of the High Command formed 3 fronts here: the Western under Marshal Timoshenko, the Reserve under Marshal Budyonny, and the Front of Reserve Armies under General Bogdanov. In total, the Soviet grouping numbered around 800,000 men, but was extremely heterogeneous in composition and level of training. Of particular value were the divisions transferred from the Far East and Siberia, fully staffed, with well-trained personnel. However, many units were hastily formed from reservists and militias who lacked sufficient military training. The technical equipment of Soviet troops also left much to be desired. After heavy losses at the beginning of the war, most units experienced a severe shortage of tanks, artillery, and communications equipment. Many divisions had only 50 to 60% of their authorized weaponry. Air cover was weakened. A significant portion of aircraft was lost in the first days of the war. Front commands were led by experienced military leaders, but at the division and regimental levels, there was a shortage of qualified commanders. Nevertheless, Soviet troops had one important advantage. They were fighting on their own land, defending the path to the heart of the country, Moscow. On July 10, 1941, one of the most dramatic battles of the initial period of the Great Patriotic War began. On this day, advanced units of Guderian's 2nd Panzer Group reached the Dnieper River near Mogilev and Orsha. At the same time, tanks of Hoth's 3rd Group crossed the western Dvina north of Vitebsk. The German command began to implement a plan to encircle Soviet troops in the Smolensk region. The offensive developed rapidly. Already on July 11th, German motorized units broke into Vitebsk. 5 days later, Smolensk was captured. On July 20th, advanced detachments of Hoth's and Guderian's tank groups linked up in the Yartsevo area, 70 kilometers east of Smolensk, closing the encirclement. 6 Soviet rifle divisions and several separate units, totaling about 100,000 people, found themselves in the cauldron. It seemed that the scenario of the Belarusian catastrophe was repeating itself. However, it was here, on Smolensk soil, that the German war machine first encountered unexpected difficulties. Soviet troops, even when encircled, did not lay down their arms but continued fierce resistance. Particularly stubborn battles unfolded in Smolensk itself, where units of the 16th and 20th Armies held the city for several days, fighting literally for every street. German tank divisions, accustomed to rapid advance, unexpectedly bogged down in protracted battles. General Guderian, commander of the 2nd Panzer Corps, noted in his memoirs, "For the first time since the beginning of the Eastern Campaign, we encountered organized and fierce resistance from the Russians. Our losses in personnel and equipment became tangible." The situation was particularly difficult for the Germans on the flanks of the offensive. While the tank wedges rushed forward, the infantry formations lagged behind, stretching the flanks of the grouping. The Soviet command immediately took advantage of this, launching a series of counterattacks against the enemy's stretched communications. Already on July 13, units of the 21st Army struck in the Bobruisk and Rogachev area, and on July 16, the 13th Army attacked the Germans in the Krychev and Propoysk area. These counterattacks, although they did not achieve strategic goals, forced the German command to divert significant forces to ensure the security of the flanks. The pace of the offensive significantly slowed down. While in the first days of the war, German tank formations advanced 50 to 60 kilometers per day. Now this figure decreased to 10 to 15 kilometers. The first weeks of the war showed that the Red Army's tactics required a radical revision. Linear defense, where troops were uniformly distributed along the front, could not withstand the concentrated tank assaults of the Wehrmacht. During the Battle of Smolensk, the Soviet command began to introduce new approaches to organizing defense, which subsequently became the basis for all military strategy. A key change was the transition from a continuous line of defense to a system of strongholds and resistance nodes. Instead of stretching forces across the entire front, Soviet troops concentrated on key directions, creating powerful pockets of defense. Each such node was transformed into a true fortress, with all-round defense, anti-tank ditches, minefields, and artillery positions. Particular attention was paid to anti-tank defense. Artillery was brought forward for direct fire, and special anti-tank destruction detachments were created, armed with anti-tank rifles, grenades, and Molotov cocktails. The experience of the first weeks of the war showed that even small groups of determined fighters could successfully combat enemy tanks. Another important innovation was the improved interaction between different branches of service. While at the beginning of the war, infantry, tanks, and artillery often acted disjointedly, they now began to coordinate their efforts. Artillery provided fire support to the infantry, tanks were used for counterattacks, and aviation, despite heavy losses, sought to cover ground troops. During the Battle of Smolensk, the Soviet command for the first time began to widely apply the scorched earth tactic. During retreats, bridges, roads, communication lines, and food depots were destroyed. Everything that could be used by the enemy. The local population was evacuated along with industrial enterprises and agricultural machinery. German troops were forced to advance through devastated territory, which significantly complicated their supplies. An important element of the new tactics was the use of night operations. Soviet troops, inferior to the enemy in technology and aviation, increasingly carried out regroupings, marches, and even attacks under the cover of darkness. German tank formations, accustomed to daytime battles, proved less effective at night. The troop command and control system also gradually improved. While at the beginning of the war, communication between units was often lost, the command now paid special attention to maintaining it. Wired communication, radio stations, messengers, and signaling devices were used for this purpose. Command posts were located closer to the front line, which allowed for quicker reactions to changing situations. The counterattacks of Soviet troops during the Battle of Smolensk became a key element of the Red Army's new defensive strategy. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the Soviet command transitioned from chaotic retreat to active offensive operations, albeit on a limited scale. Of particular importance were the counterattacks in the areas of Lapel, Bobruisk, Rogachev, and Zlobin, which, although they did not lead to the defeat of the enemy, significantly disrupted the pace of the German offensive. One of the first major counterattacks was the operation in the Lapel area, which began on July 6th. 5 mechanized corps under the overall command of General Yeremenko attacked the flank of Goth's 3rd Panzer Group. Despite insufficient coordination and a shortage of ammunition, Soviet tank crews managed to delay the advance of German troops for several days. The commander of the 3rd Panzer Group, General Goth, was forced to redeploy some of his forces to repel the attack, which slowed his advance towards Vitebsk. Even more significant were the counterattacks in the southern part of the Smolensk salient. On July 13th, units of the 21st Army under the command of General Gerasimenko struck the German Second Army in the Bobruisk and Rogachev area. Over 3 days of the offensive, Soviet troops advanced 30 kilometers and liberated Rogachev and Zlobin. This success, though local, had enormous moral significance. For the first time since the beginning of the war, Soviet troops were not retreating, but advancing. The German command was forced to hastily transfer reserves to eliminate the breakthrough. Guderian's panzer group, rushing towards Smolensk, lost some of its forces, which had to be sent south. The commander of Army Group Center, Field Marshal von Bock, noted with alarm in his diary that the Russians have switched to a new tactic. They strike the flanks of our advancing groupings, forcing us to disperse our forces. Even tactically unsuccessful counterattacks played an important strategic role. For example, the offensive of General Kachelov's group in the Krychev area on July 16th was stopped by superior enemy forces. However, it forced the German command to strengthen the flank coverage of its tank wedges, drawing off some forces from the main direction. Soviet counterattacks forced the German command to revise its strategy. If previously tank groups rapidly advanced forward, paying little attention to the flanks, now they had to act more cautiously. The pace of the offensive inevitably slowed down. The blitzkrieg, designed for rapid advance and encirclement of the enemy, began to falter. By mid-July 1941, an enormous cauldron had formed in the Smolensk region, trapping significant forces of Soviet troops. In total, 6 rifle divisions of the 16th and 20th Armies, as well as separate units totaling about 100,000 people, were encircled. However, contrary to the expectations of the German command, these troops did not lay down their arms or disperse, as often happened in the first weeks of the war. On the contrary, they organized a strong defense and began to wage stubborn battles, tying down significant enemy forces. Lieutenant General Lukin took command of the encircled group, managing to organize a circular defense and establish control over the scattered units. Soviet troops took up defensive positions along the outer perimeter of Smolensk, turning every building into a strong point. Particularly fierce battles unfolded in the area of the brick factory on the northern outskirts of the city and at the railway station. German assault groups were forced to literally gnaw their way through Soviet positions, suffering heavy losses. At the same time, the Soviet command made desperate attempts to deblock the encircled troops. On July 21, units of the 21st Army launched a powerful counterattack from the south, and on July 24, formations of the 30th Army went on the offensive from the north. Although these counterattacks did not achieve their main goal, to break through the encirclement ring, they forced the German command to withdraw significant forces from the front line to fight the advancing Soviet units. The encircled troops themselves also did not remain passive. On July 28th, they attempted a breakthrough from the cauldron in an easterly direction. Gathering all available tanks and artillery, Soviet units attacked German positions in the area of the village of Boyarshchina. As a result of a fierce battle, units of the 20th Army managed to punch a gap in the German encirclement, through which thousands of Soviet soldiers and commanders began to exit. According to the memoirs of those events, the breakthrough was carried out under extremely difficult conditions, under continuous artillery fire and aerial bombardment. Many wounded, not wishing to be a burden to their comrades, remained to cover the retreat of the main forces. The stubborn resistance of the encircled Soviet troops had enormous strategic significance. The German command was forced to commit significant forces to fight the cauldron, instead of throwing them into the development of the offensive on Moscow. Guderian's and Hoth's tank divisions, which were supposed to advance rapidly, became bogged down in protracted battles around Smolensk. The pace of the German offensive slowed catastrophically. In August 1941, during the Smolensk battle, an event occurred that became the Red Army's first serious success: the Yelnya Offensive Operation. This salient, deeply wedged into the Soviet defense, was a bridgehead from which the Germans planned to develop their further offensive on Moscow. The elimination of this dangerous salient became a priority for the Soviet command. Preparations for the operation began in late July, when, by order of the headquarters of the Supreme High Command, a special group of forces was created under the leadership of General Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. It included divisions of the 24th and 30th Armies of the Reserve Front, a total of about 100,000 people, about 1,000 guns and mortars, and about 100 tanks. Special attention was paid to enemy reconnaissance and careful planning of the operation. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the Soviet command abandoned frontal attacks and developed a complex maneuver, a double envelopment of the enemy group from the north and south, followed by the cutting off and destruction of the encircled troops. The offensive began on August 30th, after a powerful artillery barrage. Soviet troops attacked the enemy simultaneously from several directions. On the northern flank, units of the 102nd and 103rd Tank Divisions advanced, and on the southern, the 106th and 120th Rifle Divisions. The German command, not expecting such a powerful blow, was forced to transfer reserves from other sectors of the front. During fierce battles, Soviet troops broke through the enemy's defenses and began to slowly advance. Every settlement, every height became an arena for bloody battles. Particularly stubborn fighting unfolded for the villages of Ushakovo, Guryevo, and Vipolzovo, where the Germans had created powerful defense strongholds. The turning point of the operation was September 6, when Soviet troops closed the ring around the main enemy forces in the area of the city of Yelnya. By September 8, the Yelnya salient was completely eliminated, and the city was liberated. This was the Red Army's first successful offensive operation since the beginning of the war, the first liberated Soviet city. The significance of the Yelnya operation is difficult to overestimate. Although strategically it was a local success, its moral impact was enormous. For the first time, German troops were not just stopped, but pushed back. The myth of the invincibility of the Wehrmacht was dispelled. Soviet soldiers and officers saw that the enemy could be defeated. Artillery and aviation played a decisive role in slowing down the German offensive during the Battle of Smolensk. If, in the first days of the war, these branches of service acted disjointedly and inefficiently, by July 41st, the Soviet command began to use them more organizedly and purposefully. Soviet artillery, despite heavy losses in the initial period of the war, remained a formidable force. More than 3,000 guns of various calibers were concentrated in the Smolensk direction. A special role was played by BM-13 rocket launchers, nicknamed Katyusha by the soldiers. Their first combat use took place precisely during the Battle of Smolensk. On July 14th, 41st, Captain Flerov's batteries struck the Orsha railway junction, where German echelons with equipment and ammunition had accumulated. The effect was stunning. Dozens of wagons were destroyed, and German soldiers fled in panic, calling the new weapon Stalin's organ. The tactics of artillery employment also gradually changed. If earlier guns were evenly distributed along the front, now they began to be concentrated in the most important directions. Anti-tank areas were created, where up to 25 guns per kilometer of front were deployed. Such a density of fire allowed for effective combat against German tank columns. A key element of the new tactics was the massive use of artillery. On July 23rd, in the Yartsevo area, Soviet troops for the first time used artillery counter-preparation, delivering a preemptive strike against identified areas of German troop concentration. Thousands of shells rained down on enemy positions, disrupting the prepared attack. The German offensive was delayed by 24 hours. Soviet aviation, despite the colossal losses of the first days of the war, also gradually increased its activity. By the beginning of the Battle of Smolensk, About 600 aircraft were operating in this direction.
Although quantitatively they were inferior to the Luftwaffe, qualitatively the situation began to change. New Yak-1 and Lag-3 fighters arrived at the front, capable of fighting German Messerschmitts on equal terms. The tactics of aviation employment also changed. Instead of single sorties, Soviet pilots began to operate in groups, providing mutual cover. Priority targets were German tank and motorized columns on the march. Attacks by Il-2 attack aircraft, dubbed Black Death by the Germans, proved particularly effective. Their armor allowed them to operate at low altitudes, delivering precise strikes against enemy equipment. One of the most successful airstrikes was carried out on July 25th against a German tank column moving towards Yelnya. A group of 20 attack aircraft, under fighter cover, attacked the equipment stretched along the road. As a result, more than 30 tanks and armored personnel carriers were destroyed. The column was disorganized for 24 hours.
The success of a blitzkrieg has always relied on the flawless operation of its rear and supply lines. By the beginning of the Battle of Smolensk, the Wehrmacht's logistical system, which had previously functioned like a Swiss watch, began to experience serious malfunctions. While in Poland and France, German tank columns received everything they needed on time, the situation changed dramatically on the vast expanses of Russia. Stretched communications became the Achilles heel of the German offensive. By mid-July 1941, the advanced units of Army Group Center had pushed 400 to 500 kilometers deep into Soviet territory. Supplying this enormous grouping turned into a real headache for the German command. The railway network in the western regions of the USSR had a different gauge width, which required regauging tracks or transloading all materials at the border. This process consumed precious time and created bottlenecks in the supply system. Road transport could not fully compensate for these difficulties due to the poor condition of the roads. Torrential rains that hit the Smolensk region in July turned dirt roads into impassable swamps. German trucks got stuck in the mud, fuel consumption increased several-fold, and the speed of supply columns dropped to a minimum. General Guderian noted with bitterness in his memoirs, "Our tanks advanced, but fuel and ammunition remained behind installed supply vehicles." The Soviet scorched earth tactic exacerbated the problems of German logistics. During their retreat, Soviet troops destroyed bridges, water pumps, power plants, food warehouses, everything that could be used by the enemy. German engineering units had to rebuild the destroyed infrastructure, which required additional resources and time. Partisan detachments, which began to form in the forests of the Smolensk region, played a special role in disrupting German communications. Their sudden raids on supply columns, blowing up bridges and railway tracks, inflicted tangible damage on the Wehrmacht's rear services. By the end of July, the German command was forced to allocate more and more forces to protect communications, diverting them from the front line. The contrast between the initial stage of the war and the situation by the end of the Battle of Smolensk was striking. While in June, the Wehrmacht's tank divisions had almost 100% provision of everything necessary, by August, the situation became critical. Fuel reserves dwindled to an alarming minimum. There was a shortage of ammunition, food, and spare parts for equipment. Tanks and vehicles that did not receive timely maintenance broke down. Soldiers, accustomed to regular supply, began to experience a shortage of the most basic necessities. The Battle of Smolensk dealt the first serious blow to the blitzkrieg strategy on which the German command had so heavily relied. The protracted nature of the fighting, which lasted 2 months instead of the planned 2 weeks, forced Hitler and the Wehrmacht High Command, OKW, to fundamentally reconsider their plans for the Eastern Campaign. This became a turning point in the entire war, the first warning bell announcing the possible collapse of the Lightning War strategy on the Eastern Front. By the beginning of August 1941, fierce disputes erupted at Hitler's headquarters regarding the future direction of the main thrust. The chief of the Army General Staff, Colonel General Franz Halder, insisted on continuing the offensive on Moscow, considering its capture a decisive factor for victory in the war. However, Hitler, irritated by the protracted battles near Smolensk, increasingly leaned towards a change in strategy. On August 6th, the Führer gathered the supreme military leadership at his headquarters. The meeting lasted several hours and ended with the adoption of a fateful decision. Instead of an immediate offensive on Moscow, as envisioned by the original Barbarossa plan, Hitler ordered a temporary halt to the advance of Army Group Center and the redirection of a part of its forces to the flanks, to reinforce the offensive on Leningrad and Ukraine. This decision was formalized in OKW Directive No. 34 of July 30th, which effectively meant abandoning the concept of blitzkrieg in its classic understanding. Instead of a swift dash to Moscow, German troops were first to secure the flanks, capture Leningrad and Ukraine, and only then return to the offensive on the Soviet capital. This directive was a direct consequence of the Battle of Smolensk, which showed that the Red Army was capable of offering serious resistance. The Battle of Smolensk became one of the bloodiest confrontations of the initial period of the Great Patriotic War. The price paid by both sides for these 2 months of fierce fighting was colossal. According to archival data, the Red Army's losses amounted to approximately 550,000 people, of which over 300,000 were irreplaceable. For comparison, in the border battles of June 41, Soviet troops lost about 400,000 people in 2 weeks. This testified to the increased resistance and more organized nature of the combat operations. German losses were also significant, around 100,000 killed and wounded. This accounted for almost 20% of the total strength of Army Group Center. For the Wehrmacht, accustomed to lightning victories and minimal losses, this came as an unpleasant surprise. In Poland and France, German troops lost 10 to 15 times fewer personnel over comparable periods of fighting. Losses in equipment proved particularly sensitive for the Germans. Over 2 months of the Battle of Smolensk, Army Group Center lost approximately 250 tanks and 300 aircraft. Many vehicles went out of action due to technical malfunctions and a shortage of spare parts. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the rate of losses exceeded the capabilities of repair services and supplies from factories in Germany. Soviet troops paid an even higher price in equipment, approximately 2,000 tanks and 1,000 aircraft. However, unlike the first weeks of the war, when most of the equipment was lost during retreat or at airfields, these losses were now the result of active resistance. The Battle of Smolensk became a real school for the Red Army. The command learned valuable lessons that were subsequently applied in organizing the defense of Moscow. The main one was the understanding of the need for echeloned defense, instead of attempts to hold a continuous front line. The experience of creating strongholds, anti-tank areas, and mobile reserves was fully utilized in the construction of defensive lines on the approaches to the capital. The Battle of Smolensk was not merely a military operation. It changed the course of the entire Great Patriotic War. The 2-month battle on the path to Moscow laid the foundation for future victory and created the preconditions for the Wehrmacht's first strategic defeat. Let's look at the outcomes of this confrontation through the prism of its influence on subsequent events of the war. The main result of the Battle of Smolensk was the critical delay of the German offensive on Moscow. Army Group Center, which, according to the Barbarossa plan, was supposed to capture the Soviet capital by mid-August, got bogged down in battles near Smolensk for 2 whole months. This pause allowed the Soviet command to prepare Moscow's defenses, bring up reserves, and form new divisions. When the Germans finally launched Operation Typhoon in October, they encountered a completely different Red Army, more organized, trained, and ready for defense. Tactical methods tested in the Battle of Smolensk became the basis for organizing Moscow's defense. A system of strongholds instead of a continuous front line, anti-tank areas, deep echeloned defense. All these elements were first widely applied precisely near Smolensk, and then improved during the defense of the capital. As Marshal Zhukov noted, the experience of the Battle of Smolensk was invaluable to us in organizing the defense of Moscow. The Battle of Smolensk became the first serious test for the counterattack strategy, which subsequently brought success near Moscow. The Soviet command learned to concentrate forces on narrow sectors, choose the optimal time for a strike, and coordinate the actions of various branches of service. This experience was fully utilized in the December counteroffensive of '41.